There are things in life that make us uncomfortable. There are boundaries we don't like to cross, rules that we don't like to break. I, for one, found that after you go through the massive change that is puberty, which I have, shaking your butt in public isn't really cute anymore. It just makes you weird. These boundaries are driven by our expectations, our anxieties, our emotions. For example, there's a certain expectation that a speaker, like myself, should stand a comfortable distance away from his or her audience, you. I'm pretty sure that you don't expect me to walk over here into the audience and start talking and giving my speech inside the audience. That's an expectation we have. I'm pretty sure you don't expect me to get up on this table and shake. I would do it for the illustration, but I'm just going to get back over here. As a first-generation Asian American, I would say most of my perspective on boundaries are driven by my American upbringing and my Taiwanese background. Specifically for the latter, I would say most of these perspectives are influenced by my grandmother, who I call my ama. My ama immigrated over to America from Taiwan. She brought my mother and my uncle. She left behind her professional job, and she raised them in inner city LA with nothing but a few pennies to her name. Over the years, my mother and my uncle were able to get stable jobs, so she got to retire and spend her life doing what she loved to do. Travel the world, take care of patients, and terminally ill patients, and of course, take care of me. Every grandkid says this about their grandparent, but my ama was seriously the strongest, kindest, most generous woman I ever knew. There's a saying she used to tell me that basically translates to die is to stop living, but to stop living is something else entirely. As a kid, I paid a little bit more attention to my grandfather's famous adage about dating. A rabbit should have many holes, which something I definitely do not subscribe to or condone. A few years ago, my grandmother went in for a routine visit to see her primary care physician. It was just supposed to be a normal check-in, except for the fact she came out with a diagnosis, gastric cancer. We were devastated. My family and I didn't know what to do. My dad is an oncologist, so we knew what the disease trajectory looked like. We knew what families dealing with cancer immediately think about. The immediate thought flashes to the D word, death. And so that's what I want to talk to everybody about today, death. Or rather, the conversations around death, whether impending or unknown. So before I get to that, I'll address the small elephant in the room, is that I am a 20-year-old student, as are many of you. We are all healthy. I have not experienced death or anything particularly close to it. The TEDx stipulations for a speech is that the person should be, quote, an expert on the topic. And I don't really feel like an expert in anything. But the good thing is, given that we are all alive in this room, we are all equally inexperienced on the topic, which makes the conversation surrounding it that much more important. Now, here's a little meme that should tell you everything you need to know about how our generation sees death. When I die, I want the people I've done group projects with to lower me into the grave so they can let me down one last time. I've done group projects with some people in this room, so. And this is not to say that our generation, the group of college-age students to millennials, trivialize the topic or see it as something that should be laughed at, but rather that when it comes to death's impact on our own lives, we simply deflect it with humor. We avoid the topic. And this in and of itself isn't bad, but this is something that we need to address. Death is probably the best example of a euphemism. A euphemism, according to Merriam-Webster, is a mild or indirect word or expression substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. Let's read that last part again. Unpleasant or embarrassing. So instead of saying she died, it's she breathed her last breath. Or instead of, in the case of cancer, talking about the inevitable end of life, we talk about how she's fighting, or she fought till the end. In fact, English actually has over 130 different euphemisms for the word death, whereas Chinese has around 10, one of which is 见马克思, which literally translates to go and see Marx, which is a socialist euphemism that I find extremely out of touch, but still funny all the same. The point being that in our Western culture, we know that death is almost a taboo, an afterthought. We glance over it. And if we're able to do this, if every single time we talk about the word death and we reflect it with humor, how are we ever supposed to have honest conversations about it? Now, the fear of death is called thanatopia. Now, anytime there's a medical term assigned to anything, it means the experts assume it's abnormal. Wait, but this is different. Because we are all consigned to the same fate, at some level we all have thanatopia. People afflicted with it on a serious level experience anxiety, dizziness, heart palpitations, sweating, but also avoidance of family members, guilt, anger, worry. In a society so dominated by what is being done in the present by who, it makes sense we would be scared by the inevitable questions posed by death. What did they do in the past, and what can be done in the future? And this fear is so pervasive in our system, in our culture, that we see massive societal repercussions on the other end. According to Macmillan, 38% of cancer patients die in the hospital. But of those 38%, only 1% said they would have chosen to die in the hospital, and would rather, 64% of the 38% would rather choose to die at home. According to a Stanford study, 80% of Americans would choose to die at home, whereas only 20% of Americans do. So clearly there is a divide. A majority of people would like to choose to die at home with their own autonomy, choose their own end-of-life treatment, but instead, a majority of Americans actually end up dying in the hospital, in places and in situations they don't want to be. From a legal perspective, we often see that there is conflict. Patients don't make a decision maker for themselves early enough in the process, so when the time comes around, a physician doesn't know whether they should withhold or withdraw treatment from this patient. If we look at a monetary perspective, a patient who goes through traditional end-of-life care incurs $7,000 more to the system than somebody who goes through palliative care or hospice treatment, which means basically that they are treated at home instead of the hospital. If we expand this to a macro perspective, this equates to $250 million more annually. And this is not for me to quantify the value of life, saying that $7,000 is or is not too much, but rather to point out that there is a serious problem happening in our society, that we have much more money being invested into end-of-life care when a majority of patients don't even want this care and would prefer to die at home. And why does this happen? It's like I said earlier, we are scared of conversing about death. We cannot have the end-of-life discussions early enough in the process, and this is what happens. So what are we going to do? Well, there are several organizations that are trying to institutionalize end-of-life discussion. According to the Institute for Health Improvement, the Conversation Project is one of these organizations. They're trying to institutionalize end-of-life discussion into the legal process. But as far as individuals, they suggest 3 steps to starting these conversations. First, get ready. They suggest to imagine the conversation before it happens. Write out all your concerns about it. Second, get set. Brainstorm all the specifics that you need to talk to your loved ones, to talk to a parent, to talk to a family member. Talk to them about their financials, talk to them about how long they want to prolong their life. And third, and finally, go. Now this is the hardest part. If this was easy, everybody would be doing it. Before you're able to talk to somebody about the end-of-life care, you have to bring up an icebreaker. The Conversation Project suggests phrases like, "Mom, I know you're worried. I'm worried too. Can we talk about it?" Or, "Dad, I know things have been hard. They might get harder. Will you help me out?" And those are the steps we can take to start having these end-of-life discussions. So, as you all know by now, the theme for this TED conference is innovation. and I've talked about how conversations around death can help us to improve our end-of-life care, improve what's happening in our society, and hopefully help us overcome the fear that we have of it. But what does this mean for us as individuals? When my family was dealing with my grandmother's illness, we didn't really know where to start, but the good thing is she did. She had been planning for a terminal illness her entire life. She would take me to my grandfather's grave, which is up there on the left, and she would point to the plot and she would tell me, "Aaron, I bought that plot right next to him. It's going to be beautiful." She knew that end-of-life discussions were the boundaries that needed to be broken, the things that we needed to talk about. And she knew that ultimately when we did talk about them, it would lead down to a more appropriate response in the end. At the end of her life, we were able to bring her back to my uncle's house, take care of her in the way that she wanted to, and we were able to have conversations beyond just end-of-life treatment. It was, what do you want to be remembered for, and what do you want us to do to honor your legacy? So, in the end, when you have these conversations, you're able to improve upon the legacy of whoever you're talking to. And this ultimately leads to the motivation that leads to the innovation. For myself, my ama spent a lot of her life volunteering and talking in Taiwanese hospitals. And for me, I'm pursuing medicine in part because she did the same thing. I want to care for others. I want to clean them, help them out in their most uncomfortable moments. I personally want to build a healthcare system that runs more efficiently, but also more compassionately. And this is something I would have never gotten without the conversations that I was able to have. In the end, having these hard conversations are difficult, but it allows us to A, learn more about who we are and what makes you you. B, motivate us to care for our elderly and treat those people that we love in a better manner. And finally, theme of this conference, to innovate, to build upon what we know and what we want to do. Because in the end, legacy, motivation, innovation, those are the three things that life is about.